see the CWCB FACE landing page, and I'm guessing quite a few of you have already explored this to some degree, but as Megan mentioned, kind of the overall goal of today's demonstration is to really give users a resource to better understand how they can access and engage with all the FACE hazards results via all these data dashboards that we've developed for the project. And hopefully we can help spur some discussions and idea sharing for how all of you can use this information, as well as any suggestions for improving or expanding upon the structure that we've established here. So I'm just going to kind of dive right into this. As Megan alluded to earlier, we're going to keep this a little bit focused, but I do want to mention there's these series of buttons on the CWCB page here with all sorts of materials that we generated for this project. We really wanted to make this an engaging and interactive resource for folks to dive into. So there's, as you see in this bottom row of buttons here, we've kind of broken this down into different segments of the project. So feel free to dive into all those materials. I think there's a lot of helpful information there. For today's purposes, I'm going to primarily focus on this results dashboard, this results page, so the very top button there. So this will take you to a new page. Again, it's got the nice title here at the top, Future Avoided Costs Explorer. As you scroll down on the page, you'll notice that there's a little bit of introductory information. We really wanted this page to stand alone and help users who wanted to get straight to the meat and potatoes of the project. This is kind of that first stop resource. There are several hyperlinks in here, so if you do want to jump to different places in the project portal, you can quickly and easily find those. And the last thing I'll mention as I scroll down here, you'll notice that we've color-coded flood, drought, and wildfire with blue, orange, and red. We want to make that theme clear throughout the project, just because the methodology was fairly unique to each of those hazards. So you notice as I go through all the dashboards that we carry that color scheme throughout everything we've produced. All right, so the first dashboard you're going to scroll down to here is this Explore by Hazards dashboard. This is the one that I go to for most of my exploration needs. And I'm going to kind of give just a lay of the land, set some of the background information here at the beginning. A lot of this information carries through to the other dashboards, but I think it's important to go through the time to establish that here for the next 15 minutes or so. So first and foremost, working from left to right, you'll notice we have this gray box on the left. This is where you as users can come in here and select the different buttons, the different toggles to explore these different scenarios that we've analyzed and assessed. So this top row of buttons is allowing you to choose between the different hazards, so flood, drought, and wildfire were the focus for the Colorado project here. There's also a fourth button here that allows you to look at all three as a summation as well. The next row of buttons is the climate scenarios. So 3 different climate scenarios were analyzed here. Again, we tried to lean on as much of the pre-existing work the state has already done through the reports that Megan outlined earlier. The water plan in particular was a big inspiration here. So you'll notice we keep these definitions fairly generic. There is an info help button here that will help provide some of the background information explaining what is a moderate climate scenario for flood, for wildfire, for drought, because they're all slightly different based on the hazard lens you're looking through. And last, at the bottom here, you'll notice that there's 4 options for population scenarios. Again, these are based on the tech update to the Colorado Water Plan. They've already established county level population growth numbers. One of the big objectives of our task here on this project was to take those population growth numbers and distribute them on the land surface, because we need that information in order to understand where that future population is going to live on the landscape if they're exposed to flood, to drought, to wildfire. So I'll get into just a little bit of that more later, but all of this is available in the project methodology write-ups. So feel free to explore that, see how we approach this problem. But it was a unique and exciting challenge to tackle here for the project. This middle panel here, you'll see a nice big state of Colorado map with all the counties outlined. I'm currently selected the flood hazards, so they're all color-coded in blue. And the first thing I want to point out are the 3 metric boxes here at the top. So this first one on the left is the total damage metric box. So this is, as Megan alluded to earlier, this is measured in 2019 dollars. We specifically chose this unit And you can kind of think of it in terms of we're looking at 2050's climate and population scenarios and applying them to today's or 2019's economic conditions. So meaning we're not applying any discount rates or making any adjustments there. And we really wanted to do that to avoid adding any level of complexity and uncertainty to our analysis that would kind of detract from the overall goal of monetizing impacts of climate change and population growth. So that's the reason we stuck with that. Expected annual damage, again, that Megan hit on that term earlier, but it is important to understand that concept. It's a fairly commonly used measurement in the risk assessment field, but it is something that a lot of folks may be new to. So again, you can kind of think of that as an expense that would occur in any given year if monetary damages from all hazard probabilities and magnitudes were spread out equally over time. So we're not accounting for just one event, one big event. We're spreading that event in multiple smaller events across a time window. So you can kind of think of this as in terms of like a family budget in your household. You likely don't need to purchase a new or used car every year, but you can kind of plan out for that expense, those large expenses, by spreading that cost out over time. So that's the expected annual damage number that you're going to see throughout the project. The next box here in the middle, this damage per person, this is attempting to kind of provide a localized lens to view those damage values. So all we're doing here is dividing that total dollar damage, whether right now I have the whole state selected. If I click on Weld County, for example, that total damage per person is then dividing that damage by the county or the state or the region's population that you're interested in. So giving that per capita view on the damages. And then last but not least is the change from current. And there's a lot of really good information to be gleaned from just that number alone. I think oftentimes we get caught up in the overall magnitudes, but the relative change in risk here is a really important concept that this project is attempting to address. So you'll notice as we turn on future scenarios, that multiplier is going to increase based on whatever hazard scenario combination we're looking at. Underneath the map, you'll see some of these little sector icons, and I'll quickly pull out of the dashboard here and just give you the legend. Megan kind of hit on these earlier. We focus in on these 7 sectors. These are by no means intended to represent all of Colorado's risk to these 3 hazards. There's plenty of other sectors out there. We landed on these largely because they had robust data sets that we could use statewide. We felt they provide an overall representation of the larger Colorado economy. So these 7 sectors, you'll notice as you click on different hazards, we looked at different sectors. So they're not always the same based on the hazard, based on the county you're looking at. And you'll notice when you're hovering over a different county, you get these same sector icons that represent what is going into that total damage that you're seeing for Weld County on your screen. And then on the right here, this is just another lens to look at the data through a different spatial representation. We have these different regions outlined here. These were developed using kind of a hybrid of several of the state's definitions for regions. I think we largely replicated some of the regions defined by Dr. Klaus Walter at NOAA. But we did make some subtle alterations to account for some of the economic zones across the state. So this, again, if you want to click on the different bubbles or the different regions, you get those counties selected on the map for you, and you can kind of get those metrics displayed at the top based on the regional view of things. All right, so that's kind of a lay of the land, giving you just a brief walkthrough of what's all available here on this dashboard. I'm going to spend the next few minutes just stepping through some examples of one for each of the hazards, just kind of throwing out an idea of how, as an example user, I might want to interact with and find the different information that's available here. So we're going to start with the drought hazard, and I've turned it back to the current climate, current population scenarios. We're going to take a look at Yuma County out here on the Eastern Plains. Yuma County is the second largest ag producing county in the state. I think over $1 billion in ag products sold every year. So as you can see, when I toggle on the drought hazard here, there's 2 sectors that are being incorporated in this analysis: the cattle industry and the crop industry. A lot of the local economy is driven by the ag sector out here, so it makes sense to kind of take a peek at what drought might do in the future here. So as for example, maybe I'm a state legislator for the district representing Yuma County, and I want to better understand the potential for for future damages in Yuma County. Maybe I want to compare to neighboring counties or other regions across the state. But first, I want to get a mindset of what's going on under future scenarios for Yuma County. So as you can see, I've selected Yuma here. We're looking at right around $8.6 million in expected annual damage due to drought. Drought is a common hazard here in Colorado. We're in one right now for a good portion of the state. So it makes a lot of sense that expected annual damage is ever present for a lot of the states. But right now, $8.6 million for current conditions, that comes out to about $860 per person. So again, just dividing that damage by the total population, which is around 10,000 people for Yuma County currently. So what I'm going to do next is just turn on a moderate climate and a low growth future. So kind of getting a low end range of what 2050 future holds for Yuma County. When I turn those two on and then I'll select Yuma County here again, we're now looking at $31 million in damage. So a pretty sizable increase. That's in terms of multiplier, that's a 3.6x increase over where we were currently. And that number is also representing a slight population decrease for Yuma County. A lot of rural Colorado under the low population growth actually shows just a slight decrease. That'll go away as we turn up the population even higher, but just keep that in mind that some counties go up a ton and some actually decrease just a little bit. So it's important that information is all available in the pop-ups here, but it is important to consider those when you're looking at the damage estimates. So that comes out to around $3,100 per person if we were to average that damage across the population. Again, that's not how this works out. A lot of times people feel the impacts and some people don't. So just putting it into a local perspective here with that damages per person. All right, so one more scenario here. Let's turn it all the way up to the more severe climate and the high growth scenario. So just to kind of get a sense of that high end future risk that we could be facing here in Yuma County. So we now see damages up to $41 million. They actually stay the same in terms of per person damages, and that's due to, you can see here, an actual 30% increase in the population of Yuma County. But at the end of the day, that's still a 4.7x increase over where we were currently. So a sizable increase in the drought hazard risk for Yuma County under this range of scenarios that we just looked at. All right, so that's a quick example of how somebody might come into and look at the drought conditions under our scenario explorer here. Let's turn this back to the current conditions, and we're going to look at flood here real quick. So for flooding, we're going to take a quick peek at Larimer County here in northern Colorado. Larimer County on the northern border that contains the city of Fort Collins, Loveland, and several of the other suburbs in and around there. Under current conditions, as I've currently toggled on here, we have about $13 million in damage, expected annual damage. So flooding is, of course, no stranger to the Fort Collins area in the past. But now let's look at this through the lens of maybe I'm a county planner tasked with identifying what does the future flood risk look like from just population growth, just development within the county. So for this example, let's just turn on the low growth scenario. So again, we were at 13 million. We're going to select Larimer County. So we see a slight increase, up to $14 million in damage now, just a 10% bump in where we were currently. And it's worth just prefacing here that our model assumptions are assuming that all of the floodplain regulations that are currently in place, so a lot of floodplain development in the 100-year floodplain is regulated to be built to withstand that 100-year, and there's some freeboard included there. So all of these damages, these new damages, are largely being attributed to new developments occurring in the 100-year to 500-year range. So new development just outside that regulated floodplain, but where people are expected to grow under, or where development is expected to grow under this future scenario. So let's bump this up just one more scenario here up to the high growth scenario. And I should have mentioned, I think the low growth resulted in like a 30 to 40% increase in the population. Under the high growth scenario, we're approaching a doubling of the population here in Larimer County. So almost a 90% increase. And we notice those damages went up to $24 million of expected annual. And that's about an 80% increase. We're getting close to doubling those damages. And that's to be expected if you add more population to the county and under the assumptions that some of those people are going to be developing in that area between the 100-year and 500-year floodplain. Their overall probabilistic risk may be relatively low, but there's more exposure there now. So there is that risk for more damage in the future under this scenario. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier, right now I've toggled on the damages. The color scheme is representing just the total damage. Under each of these metric boxes, there's a toggle to then change the color scheme to represent that metric. So now I can see the color scheme showing the damages per person. I can also see that color scheme representing just the change in damage, the change from current. So a few different ways to view the map. I left it on the total damage here just for these quick examples, but that is available underneath those metric boxes to kind of look at the map in through a different lens. All right, and then we're going to do one last example here for the wildfire hazard. We're going to take just a slightly different approach here. Instead of honing in at the county level, I'm going to click on the Western San Juan Mountain region. So maybe for this example, I'm a member of the Southwest Basin Roundtable, and I'm tasked with quantifying what the wildfire risk in the region looks like due to just climate change. So without getting into what the population growth plays into as far as future risk, let's just look at how climate change impacts the region in terms of wildfire risk. So under the current situation, we're looking at about $23 million in damage per year. That's not surprising. I know La Plata County's been having fires here just within the last couple of weeks or so. So all these counties are susceptible to wildfire. I think everybody who lives in that region or is familiar is aware of that. There's actually, I think, 8 counties included in our region here. But that total value comes out to about $23 million. Average that out to about $220 per person. And as I mentioned earlier, let's look at that under a new climate scenario. So let's turn to the moderate climate 2050 scenario. So now we're seeing about $37 million in expected annual damage, which is about a 60% increase over where we were currently. So again, some helpful information to kind of set that range of what the future holds in terms of just changing our climate. If we bump that up one more to a more severe climate, we're going to see just a slight increase, up to $38 million in damage, expected annual damage, about a 70% increase. So a fairly small range in what the future holds for these two scenarios. But again, some nice information to help you get a grasp for when isolating just the climate impact to the wildfire hazard, what we're looking at for this region of the state. All right, and then I wanted to touch on just briefly here, I'm not going to give an example of how you might use this, but there is the all hazards button here, which is going to sum up all those different damages for the 3 hazards based on whatever scenario you're looking at, and just sum them up statewide at the county level. It's important to remember that these hazards aren't in their own isolated world. There's compounding impacts for all 3 of these hazards. Drought is strongly correlated with wildfire. Wildfire leads to burn scars and more flooding impacts on those burn scars. So there's a lot of interplay between these 3 hazards, and it's important to make sure we're accounting for that and looking at that at the local scale. This summation is just adding up those 3 hazards. So we provide some of that background context for how compounding impacts are important to account for in some of the case studies that we provided on that landing page. So I'd encourage everybody to dive into those, and if you're looking at this through the local lens, that's something that should also be incorporated into your local assessment. All right. So as we scroll down on the page now, as we go down, I did want to mention there's these 2 hyperlinks right underneath the dashboard. I'm anticipating a lot of you have questions as to, well, how are we coming up with the methodology to quantify all this? We went through a lot of effort to provide that in a very summarized version. So there's some very interactive, scrollable sort of pages that provide that information. We also have a full technical report, and that hyperlink's up here above as well. But again, we wanted to make that information readily available right on the same pages that you're looking at the results here. So again, those links are right there. There's also this access data link. This will take you directly to the CWCB FTP page. We've uploaded and we're hosting the spreadsheets, the data tables that are feeding into these dashboards. So if we're not displaying information in a way that you would like to see it, you have access to all of those data tables, all that information right here on the CWCB page. All right, so let's keep scrolling down here on the dashboards. The next interactive dashboard we're going to look at is this Explore by Sector and Region dashboard. So I'm just going to make this full screen so everybody can see this. All right, so we kind of just looked at a county level focus view on more so the hazard side of things, so flood, drought, and wildfire. This dashboard is intended to kind of provide more of a sector view on things at the regional level. So we're really looking for this dashboard to provide a viewpoint for understanding the full range of risk under all the combinations of scenarios that we looked at for each of these sectors and hazards. So let's just say, for example, and one quick, let me open that back up here again. Let's just say, for example, in this case, we're interested in the ski industry. Maybe we live in the Central Mountains and want to get a sense for what the ski industry is anticipated to experience in terms of drought hazard risks. So I've honed in on the recreation group and clicked on the ski industry here, and let's click on the Central Mountains since a lot of our resorts are focused in this area. So now you kind of see this matrix or this table of different bar charts displayed on the screen here. This is intended to provide the full gamut of the scenarios that we looked at. So you can see in the upper left, this is our current climate, current population. So right now, ski resorts are experiencing, in our analysis, around $31 million of expected annual damage. That's not to say that every year that's what they're experiencing. That's the average, as I mentioned earlier. And as you move from left to right and from top to bottom, that's where we're changing the climate, changing the population. So as you start to interplay those different combinations of scenarios, you see in the bottom right, we then end up with around $220 million of expected annual damage, which is a huge increase in what the ski industry might anticipate under future conditions to experience in terms of damage. So all 7 of the sectors are available in here. You can view these for each of the regions, and as you expect, there's not any ski resorts out on the southeastern part of the state. So that's where you would go to some of the ag and the infrastructure and be able to explore which of those sectors you're most interested in. All right, moving down even further here, the last damage dashboard that you can interact with is this Explore by Future scenario. So if I make this full screen here, the upshot with this dashboard is we're really looking to give a perspective on which hazard sector combinations are the most vulnerable in terms of just total economic damages. So just looking at the dollar value damages. So let's just, for example, again, go up to the Northern Plains here. Again, a very ag-dependent region of the state. So you notice a lot of these other sectors are relatively small expected annual damages. The crop sector is really the one that stands out, as we all would expect. And as I turn on these different, basically the low end and the high end future, you can see these different icons move from left to right. And this is really trying to give you a sense of how those damages are expected to grow, to increase in the future based on the climate and population scenarios that we've already touched base on. So up to $160 million just under the moderate climate and low growth scenario. And then if we go up to the high end scenario here, so a more severe climate and the high population growth, we're looking at right around $210 million in damage for just the crop sector in this region. And as it's interesting to just hop across the state, look at different regions to see which sectors, which hazards really stand out, and just in terms of total economic damages. Like the urban corridor, for example, here, as we know, there's a lot of people, so the building infrastructure is the one that really stands out here in terms of both flooding and wildfire impacts. And again, the big take-home message here is to kind of get a glimpse into how those damages change under looking at current and future scenarios. All right, and then last but not least, now that we've kind of established in everybody's minds what the risk portfolio looks like for your area of interest, the next thing we want to do is really provide some context for, well, what can we do about that? What can we do? What are tangible resilience actions that we can do now that will help us mitigate those future damages? So this last dashboard here is the Explore Resilience Actions dashboard. And there's a lot of information to cover here, but I do want to spend just a little bit of time So the upshot with this dashboard is we're looking to provide an interactive resource for kind of continuing that discussion and taking the next step. What can be done now to promote resilience? There's already a lot of really good work that's being done across the state, and there's already a lot of really good information. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. Instead, we're attempting to kind of aggregate all the different strategies and information that the state, the counties, the cities, municipalities are already providing, are already available. We want to help stimulate that conversation amongst all Coloradans to share ideas and share best practices. So this dashboard, just kind of giving another lay of the land here, was inspired by the concept of a quad chart that economists often use. It's really kind of an efficient way to display resilience ideas with multiple characteristics, multiple variables, in an illustration that lets you sort of compare and sort ideas in a relative sense. So we're not trying to be a prescriptive or ranking these in any sort of fashion. It's more or less a platform for just exploring all the different resilience actions that are out there. And this is by no means all of the ideas that are out there. This is just a subset of some of the ones that the state is already providing some really helpful information on. So I just want to give a quick context for what's going on here. You'll notice that all these options are you can click on them and get some information. We have them sorted by hazard. So if you want to look at flooding, drought, wildfire, those toggles are up here in the upper right. The other thing to note on the graphic here itself, we have cost on the y-axis. So from bottom to top, costs are increasing relatively. And then from left to right, we're looking at the level of effort. So the man hours, the political hurdles that have to be overcome to accomplish some of these resilient strategies. The color coding is attempted to kind of represent what sort of characteristic those strategies have, whether they're reducing, responding. I think the other one that isn't showing up for wildfire here is recovering from the hazard. And then the last little variable that you'll notice is the size of the icon is intended to represent this added value characteristic. This is attempting to represent if that strategy is applicable to multiple sectors, for example, or multiple hazards, or addresses social equity issues. We wanted to provide a way to give those a little bit more visualization weights. That's how we came up with this method of displaying all this information. There's 100 different ways to slice and dice this. This is just our first stab at providing this information right alongside all the other risk damage assessments that you've already scrolled through. So let's just take one quick example here. Let's click on the regulate development in the high risk zones for the wildfire hazard. Each of these strategies has a detail section, just providing a very quick summary of what exactly that entitles. Some examples of resources for in this example, regulate development in high risk zones, so the National Flood Protection Association. Again, we're scraping a lot of the information that state and counties are already providing on their own websites. And then we also want to provide a real world example of how people in Colorado are already incorporating some of these ideas. So if your neighboring county has adapted something, we want to make sure we provide just a little bit of information here to help you know who to reach out to across the state to get some of those best practices and some of those ideas, and have a resource for learning more about how you can apply this locally. So yeah, that's generally where we ended up with this dashboard. There's a lot of information under the hood of this. We also provide the spreadsheet, the table that feeds this dashboard. So if you want to pull this down and get access to that, again, that's on the CWCB FTP page, readily available for anybody to download and provide some